she thought nobody noticed her. But for 3 years, one man had noticed everything. Montana Territory, in the spring of 1883, was a country so wide it made a person feel like a single struck match in an empty room, and it was to the far northern edge of that country, to the Locke Ranch beneath the Bear Paw benchlands, that a thin, hollow-eyed woman calling herself Nell came walking one raw April morning with a carpetbag and no history she was willing to give. Garrett Locke was 34 that spring, and he had never married, and the county had long since stopped wondering why. Because a man who ran 8,000 acres and 40 hands without raising his voice above what was needed did not owe anyone an accounting of his heart. He was not widowed. He had simply grown, over a solitary boyhood and a solitary young manhood, into a man who found silence more honest than most conversation, and who had learned early that the fewer words a man spent, the less chance those words had of being turned against him later, a lesson his own hard-mouthed father had taught him with a belt rather than a sermon, and that Garrett had carried west and built a whole quiet life around. He hired the woman on sight the day she came walking up his lane, because his cook of 11 years had died that winter and the bunkhouse was eating burnt beans, and because there was something in the careful, frightened way she held herself that Garrett recognized without being able to name it, the look of a person who expects, at any moment, to be asked to leave. "Nell," she said, when he asked her name, half a beat too late, the way a person answers to a name they have only just begun wearing. "Locke," Garrett said, and did not press her on it. "Kitchen's through there. Bunkhouse eats at 6 and noon. There's a cabin out back you can have to yourself. Door's got a good bar." He nodded once, the whole of the interview, and walked off toward the corrals. And that might have been the entirety of what passed between Garrett Locke and the woman he hired, in words, for a very long time. But 3 days later, walking the ranch yard before dawn, as he always did, Garrett saw a crumpled paper blown against the fence rail, come loose from some drifter's saddlebag or a lawman's pocket in town, and he picked it up out of idle habit and went very still. It was a wanted notice, curling and weathered, out of the Wyoming Territory courts. "Wanted for the murder of her husband, Horace Langley," it read, above a woodcut likeness that was crude, as such likenesses always were, but not so crude that Garrett Locke could fail to recognize, under the smudged ink, the particular frightened set of the eyes that had looked up at him 3 days before and answered a half-beat late to a name that was not her own. Vera Langley, the poster named her. Reward $1,000. Garrett Locke stood alone in his own ranch yard in the gray dawn with a fortune's worth of paper in his hand, and made, in the space of about 1 minute, the decision that would shape the next 3 years of both their lives, though only one of them would know it. He did not go to the sheriff. He did not confront her. He folded the poster small and put it in his coat, and told no living soul, and went in to breakfast and ate the eggs she had cooked him, and said nothing at all beyond his ordinary quiet thanks, because Garrett Locke had learned long before that meeting the person who framed her would matter a great deal more than meeting the paper that named her, and he did not yet know which he had hired. He began, from that morning, to watch her the way he watched weather coming, carefully, silently, and with his whole considerable attention. It took him the better part of a year, working through a lawyer in Helena and a careful roundabout correspondence he told no one about, to learn the truth of Wyoming, that Vera Langley's husband Horace had been a modest rancher, with a modest fortune and one dangerous business partner, a smooth, ambitious man named Cyrus Wexford, who had wanted the whole of a jointly held herd and the water rights that came with it, and had shot Horace Langley in his own barn one night and put the pistol, after, in his terrified widow's hand before the neighbors came running, and had testified, with tears that convinced a whole county that he had arrived only in time to see her standing over the body. Vera had run rather than hang for a crime that had needed her ruin as much as her husband's death, and Cyrus Wexford had inherited, by quiet arrangement and a grieving widow's absence, everything the two men had built together, and had gone on, in the years since, to become exactly the kind of prosperous, respected man whose word a territory believed without question. Garrett Locke learned all of this a piece at a time, at the cost of considerable money and greater patience, and told the woman cooking his supper not one word of it, because he had decided that first gray morning that a woman who had already been disbelieved by an entire territory did not need one more man deciding things about her without asking, and because he did not yet know how to say, in any words he owned, that he believed her without ever having heard her side of it at all. What he did instead, the narrator will tell you, was smaller than words and larger than them both. He noticed that her cabin door stuck badly in the cold, and one week it did not stick any more, and no one had seen who fixed it. He noticed she favored the thicker firewood for the cook stove because it burned longer through the night, and from that winter on the woodpile by her door was always split fine and stacked close, dry under its own little lean-to roof, replenished before she ever thought to ask. Though not a single ranch hand ever claimed the chore, and she never once caught anyone at it. He noticed, the second winter, that her coat was thin, and a heavier one appeared folded on her cabin step, with no note and no name, in a size that fit her exactly, though he had never once measured her, having only watched, with a rancher's careful eye for judging size at a distance. The way a man judges the girth of a horse he means to fit a saddle to. He noticed when the well water ran low and a new pump appeared at the kitchen door before she had said a word of complaint to anyone. He noticed and noticed and noticed for 3 years and said almost nothing the entire time, and Vera Langley, who called herself Nell, and believed herself invisible on that vast ranch, the way she had trained herself to be invisible ever since Wyoming, small and quiet and unremarked, because a woman who is not noticed cannot be recognized, put every one of those small mercies down to chance, or to a well-run ranch, or to hands who were kinder than most, and never once, in 3 whole years, imagined that a single silent man was standing behind the whole of it. There was an evening in the second winter when a blizzard came down sudden off the benchlands, and Vera, caught out checking her hens, lost the path back to her cabin in the white roar of it, and stood, for one terrifying minute, entirely turned around in a world gone featureless, and out of the white came Garrett Locke, without a lantern, walking the fence line by memory alone, because he had marked, without her ever knowing it, exactly how long she had been out, and exactly how long was too long. He did not take her arm. He walked a pace ahead of her, breaking the wind, until her own cabin door showed pale through the snow, and then he touched 2 fingers to his hat and turned back into the storm without a single word passing between them, and Vera stood in her own doorway a long moment afterward, with her heart going hard in her chest, for reasons the cold alone did not explain. It was that same winter, on an ordinary Tuesday, that became, without either of them planning it, anything but ordinary, that Vera first got more than a dozen words out of Garrett Locke at one sitting. She had taken to leaving him coffee at the kitchen table after the hands had gone through and eaten, a small quiet hour before he rode out that neither of them had ever named as anything, and on this particular evening a norther had the windows rattling, and Garrett had lingered instead of going straight to the barn, turning his cup in his hands the way a man turns a thing when he is working up to speech. That coat, Vera said, because the silence between them had gotten easier over 2 winters, and she had grown bold enough to prod at it. left on my step last January. No note, no name. I never did find out whose kindness that was." "Ranch keeps a store of extras," Garrett said, not quite meeting her eye. "For hands that come through thin. Funny sort of extra," Vera said, "that fits a woman's shoulders exact, and never once got offered to any of the hands, thin or otherwise. In 3 winters I've watched them freeze in the same coats." She was smiling, a small, careful thing, testing the ground. "You are a terrible liar, Miss Locke, for a man who says so little." Garrett's ears went red above his collar, and for a moment she thought he would simply rise and go, the way he ended most conversations that pressed too near him. Instead, he sat a while longer turning the cup, and said, "Lo, my father was a hard man with his tongue. Beat sense into me with words when the belt wasn't handy, and taught me early that whatever I said out loud could be used against me later, one way or another, so I quit saying much of anything I wasn't sure was safe. It is not that I do not have things to say, Nell." He caught himself on the false name, and something crossed his face, quick, that she did not yet understand. "It is that I trust a thing I've done a great deal further than a thing I've said. Words come cheap. A stacked woodpile costs a man an hour with an axe on a cold night, and he does not do it unless he means it." "And did you mean it?" Vera asked, very quietly, "whatever it was you meant?" "I expect I did," Garrett said, and could not quite look at her when he said it, and rose and took his hat off the peg and went out to the horses, leaving her sitting at her own kitchen table with her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, and the coffee gone cold, and the beginning, though she did not yet know to call it that, of the first real courtship either of them had ever properly had. Before the trouble came up out of Wyoming, and it would, soon enough, the way old trouble always finds a woman who thinks she has outrun it, there was one more quiet season at the Locke Ranch. The woodpile always full, the pump always primed, a silent man walking a fence line in a blizzard for no reason he would ever give a name to. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What happens next is the part that changes everything. And if tales of love that outlast the hardest country the West could offer are the kind that keep you company, the small bell beneath this story is how we go on meeting like this. Cyrus Wexford came to Montana on cattle business in the 3rd spring, prosperous and smiling and building, the county paper said, toward a run for territorial office, and it was pure ill chance, the kind history is full of, that brought his fine carriage through the rail town nearest the Locke Ranch on his way to a stock sale. On the same gray morning, Vera Langley stood at the seed merchant's counter with her bonnet pushed back against the heat of the stove inside. She heard the carriage before she saw it, and stepped out onto the boardwalk from simple, idle habit, and there, not 30 feet off in an open landau with 2 matched bays, sat the smiling, prosperous, silver-templed man she had last seen weeping false tears over her husband's grave. Cyrus Wexford was looking directly at her. For one endless second, neither of them moved, and Vera watched recognition cross his handsome face like a shadow crossing water. First puzzlement, then disbelief, then a stillness far colder than his smile had ever been. "Mrs. Langley," he said, soft, wondering, testing the name on his tongue as though he could not quite credit his own eyes. "I had heard you were dead." "You had hoped it, Mr. Wexford," Vera said, and her voice, to her own considerable surprise, did not shake. "There is a difference, and you know it better than any man alive." "I am glad to find I was mistaken," Wexford said, and the smile came back down over his face like a shutter, and he touched his hat with a courtesy that chilled her more than any threat, and gave the driver the order to go on, and the fine carriage rolled away down the rutted street toward the stock sale, unhurried, as though nothing at all had happened. But Vera Langley stood on that boardwalk with her seed sack forgotten in her arms, and knew, with a certainty that turned the whole bright morning cold, that Cyrus Wexford had not driven 300 miles into Montana to leave a resurrected witness standing quietly in a rail town. He did not. By that same evening he had hired the meanest tracker in 3 counties, a hard, quiet man named Dutch Corrigan, who worked for money and asked no questions, and set him after the woman with instructions that made no pretense of an arrest, for Cyrus Wexford could not afford a trial that would put his dead partner's widow in a courtroom to tell her side of that night in the barn, not with a territorial nomination coming. He needed her gone, quietly and for good, before she could ever be brought in front of a judge to speak. Garrett Locke learned of the stranger's questions in town the same evening, from a hand who mentioned, idle, that a rough sort had been asking after the Locke Ranch's cook by a name that was not Nell, and for the first time in 3 years of silent watching, Garrett understood that watching alone would not be enough. He went to her cabin that night and knocked, and when she opened the door pail and already half guessing, he told her, plainly and all at once, the whole 3 years of it, the poster found blown against the fence, the lawyer in Helena, the truth of Cyrus Wexford and the barn and the pistol placed in her shaking hand, the woodpile, the coat, the well pump, the blizzard, every silent thing he had done and never once explained, laid bare in one halting, unpracticed rush of words from a man who had spent his whole life believing silence was safer than speech. "I have known what you were running from since your 3rd day on this ranch," Garrett said. "I did not tell you, because I did not want you to spend 3 years looking over your shoulder at me the way you'd learned to look at everyone else. I wanted you to have one place in this world where nobody was deciding things about you. So I decided things about you instead, in secret, which I see now was its own kind of taking your choice away, and I am sorry for that part of it, even though I am not sorry for a single log I split." His voice was rough with disuse at saying so much at once. "There is a man in town tonight asking after you by your true name, sent, I would wager everything I own, by Cyrus Wexford himself. I do not aim to let him take you anywhere. But you are the one who has been running 3 years, Vera, and I will not decide this next part for you the way I decided the rest. Tell me what you want done, and I will do it, or stand aside, whichever you say." Vera Langley stood in her own cabin doorway and heard, for the first time in 3 years, the sound of her own true name spoken gently by another human being, and something in her that had been braced and small since a barn in Wyoming came. At last, unclenched, "You knew," she said, wondering, the whole time. "The wood, the coat, the pump. That was you." "That was me," Garrett said. "Near enough, most of it." "I thought I was invisible here," Vera said. "I have spent 3 years being grateful to a ranch that ran itself kindly, and it was never the ranch at all. It was one man, watching, and never once asking to be thanked for it." Her voice caught. "Nobody has ever paid that much attention to me and wanted nothing back. My own husband never watched me that close, Garrett Locke, and he was supposed to love me." "I don't want thanks," Garrett said. "I want you standing here in the morning. That is the whole of what I have wanted the entire 3 years, and I find, now that I have finally said 1,000 words in a row for the first time in my life, that I would like to say a few more, if you will let me." He took off his hat, the way he had the very first day. "I never once asked whether you were guilty, Vera, because I never once believed it, not from the first morning, and a man does not spend 3 winters chopping wood for a murderer. I love you. I have loved you a long while in a language of firewood and coat linings because I did not trust myself to say it any plainer, and I am done keeping it silent now that trouble has found you, because I find a silent love is no protection at all against a man like Wexford, and you deserve to be loved out loud. The kiss she gave him then, in her own cabin doorway with the Montana dark coming down cold around them, was brief, and it broke something open in her that 3 years of careful invisibility had frozen shut. The plain astonishment of being loved, not despite her hiding, but in the whole quiet architecture of it, watched over so thoroughly and so gently that she had mistaken the watching for mere kindness of a place, and never once for the devotion of a man. Dutch Corrigan came for her 2 nights later, in the dark, meaning to take her quiet and be gone before the ranch woke. The dogs went quiet too suddenly, which was itself the alarm Garrett had trained himself for years to hear even in his sleep, and he came up off his cot with his rifle already in his hand and no lamp lit, moving through the black ranch yard by the same long memory that had once walked a blizzard's fence line for her. He reached Vera's cabin as a shape came off the porch rail toward her door, and there was no time for a challenge in the dark. Corrigan heard him coming and turned with a blade already drawn, and the 2 men went down together in the frozen dooryard mud in a hard, graceless, silent scramble that had none of the clean drama of a gunfight and all of the ugly truth of a real one. Elbows and boot heels, and one white gasp of pain when the knife opened a line along Garrett's forearm, the blood black in the moonless dark, and still he did not let go. It was Vera who ended the worst of it. She came out of her cabin not screaming but level, the way 3 winters of watching a quiet man had taught her a person could be afraid and steady at once, and she brought down the flat of a fire iron across Corrigan's shoulder with her whole weight behind it, hard enough that his knife hand opened and the blade went skittering off into the dark. And between the 2 of them, a bleeding rancher and a woman who had once been told she was too broken to fight for herself, Dutch Corrigan ended the night face down in his own dooryard dirt, with his wrists lashed in harness leather, and every ounce of his hired confidence gone out of him. "Who sent you?" Garrett said, low, pressing his good hand hard against his own bleeding arm, "and do not waste my patience telling me it was no one." Corrigan, staring up at the woman with the fire iron and the rancher who had taken a knife rather than let go of him, decided, as such men generally do once the fight has gone out of the night, that his employer's silence was worth a good deal less than his own neck. "Wexford," he said, sullen, into the dirt. "Cyrus Wexford. Paid me to see she never troubled him again. Nothing more particular than that, and I'll say so before any judge you like if it buys me out of a rope. But it was Vera Langley who ended Cyrus Wexford, and she ended him with a letter, not a fight." She had spent the 2 days since Garrett's confession writing, by lamplight, the whole true account of the night in the Wyoming barn. Every detail a frightened woman had been too broken to give a court 3 years before, set down now plain and cold and exact, with Garrett's Helena lawyer's name attached, and a promise of testimony behind it. And she sent it not to a Montana sheriff, but straight to the territorial newspaper, covering Wexford's rising political ambitions, where a story of a respectable man's dead partner's widow surfacing alive with an account of murder was worth a great deal more, to an editor hungry for circulation, than any quiet arrest could have been. The story ran within the fortnight, under Vera Langley's own name, printed at last in her own words instead of a coroner's crude summary, and a territory that had once believed Cyrus Wexford's tears over a fresh grave now read a widow's plain, unshaking account and believed her instead. His nomination collapsed inside a week. The old Wyoming case was reopened on the strength of new testimony no one could any longer call unavailable, and Cyrus Wexford, prosperous smile and all, was arrested that same season on the original charge, with Dutch Corrigan's own sworn account of being hired to silence a witness laid on top of it like the final nail in a coffin he had built for himself 20 years too slow to see coming. By the following spring, the Locke Ranch had a woodpile that two people tended together, turn and turn about. Because Vera Langley had informed her husband plainly that she intended to split her own kindling from now on, thank you, though she would not object if he wished to keep her company while she did it. And Garrett Locke, who had spent a lifetime believing that love was a thing better shown than said, found he had grown. In the year since that dark cabin doorway, rather fond of saying it anyway, at odd hours, for no reason at all. Simply because he had discovered a woman who had gone 3 years without hearing it, and meant to make up the difference. They were married at the ranch house in the green of that second spring, with the whole outfit standing witness, and old Mrs. Pruitt's counterpart among Montana housekeepers weeping happily into her apron, and the hands who had never once caught Garrett Locke at his quiet chores now teased him openly over the wedding supper about 3 years of firewood, and Garrett bore it with the same faint red climbing his ears that had once given him away over a coffee cup. Vera wore no grand gown. She wore, at her throat, the same plain locket that had once held nothing at all, and now held a single dried wildflower Garrett had left, unremarked, on the corner of her cabin step the week after the fight in the dooryard, and had never once mentioned since. Cyrus Wexford was tried and convicted at the Wyoming Assizes that autumn on the strength of the reopened case, Corrigan's sworn word, and Vera's own plain, unshaking testimony given at last, 3 years overdue. In a courtroom that finally listened, he went to the territorial prison rather than the rope, which Vera found, to her own surprise, she preferred, since a hanged man is remembered as a tragedy, and a jailed one is simply remembered as caught. The nomination he had wanted so badly went instead to a lesser man with a duller ambition, and the Wyoming paper that had once printed a widow's letter to save its own circulation printed, a year later, the news of her Montana wedding as a happier kind of story, and she let them print it, because she had learned that a name once cleared belongs to its owner again, to spend as she liked. By the second Montana winter, there was a child coming, and Garrett Locke, who had grown up believing a house was safest when no one in it said very much at all, took to talking to his wife's rounding middle in the evenings by the fire in a low, steady voice, telling the unborn child things he had never once told a living soul before Vera, about his hard-mouthed father, about the belt and the silence it taught him, about a woman who had walked up his lane one gray April morning with no history she was willing to give, and had, without either of them planning it, taught an entire ranch how much could be said with an axe and a woodpile, and enough patience to wait 3 years for the words to catch up. And on the anniversary of the night he had first told her everything, every year after, Garrett Locke split one log by hand himself, alone, before dawn, and set it apart from the rest of the pile, where she would find it first thing. A small, silent inheritance of the 3 years he had loved her, before either of them had ever said the word aloud. And Vera Langley Locke, who had once believed herself the most unnoticed woman on the whole wide Montana bench, would find it there each year in the gray morning light, and know exactly what it meant, and never once need him to explain it again. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet, in split firewood and a coat left with no name attached, and waited 3 whole years to finally say itself out loud, then this story was for you. Out on the high grass of Montana, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Garrett Locke and the woman who thought no one saw her became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. He watched her for 3 years before he ever spoke, and when trouble finally came looking for her, it found a man who had already decided, in silence, exactly how far he would go. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, old injustice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.